Okay, back again. Another episode of A Muslim and an Atheist Breaks Bread. What you saying, Pops?
I'm good, man.
Damn, winter is upon us, people. Full effect.
No, we're warming up for it, you mean? 11 degrees, apparently.
11 degrees. This
Doesn't
is
feel
11
like 11 in here.
Oh, no, yeah, 11
Minus
degrees.
11.
Okay, so I'll let you intro this video, Pop.
Okay, let's have a look at it. See what's on the TV.
Okay. We don't want to tell people what we're watching or...
Yeah, but can I read it?
Yeah, you can read it. I guess that would be fair.
That would be helpful. I know it's another film in line with the stuff we've been doing, looking at Indian aspects of India. This one is Indians in the Caribbean. So here we're just looking at, again, migration patterns, how Indians became such a significant portion of the people in the Caribbean, how they got there, hopefully. Interesting, again, just raising awareness that the Caribbean isn't really Africans alone. It's a mix of all sorts of people.
Was the Caribbean even... like... see, people predominantly think like, oh, you're black, you're from the Caribbean, but originally was black, and when I say black, I mean like Afro from the diaspora. Was that Caribbean? Or were, from my understanding, black people brought there to work the plantations, in essence, is what I'm trying to ask you.
Well, from modern history, black people were brought to the Americas. So if you listen to what we're taught in school, then all black people in the Americas came on the slave ships.
Yes.
But more recently, you'll see there is historical evidence of societies before. Mm-hmm. For example, the Olmec heads in South America kind of infer that there were some black people there a while back.
Yeah.
You know, there are arguments to and for. Mm-hmm. But the significant proportion of people there are African descent these days. I think the Americas tend to be a lot more focused on their native culture than Caribbean people. Caribbean people just accept the mix.
Okay. All right, let's jump into the video and see what it says here.
Carib Nation would be looking at East Indians in the Caribbean. We would be looking at how East Indians came from India and what they have been doing in the Caribbean over the last 160 years.
160.
Probably about at 40 because you know this video was made in the 60s, yeah?
Welcome to Carib Nation. I'm Paul Nehru, Tennessee. Today we would be looking at East Indians in the Caribbean. We will be examining many aspects of the Caribbean people's lives with respect to the East Indians. For example, how did they get from India to the Caribbean? And over the last 160 years, what they've been doing in the Caribbean. Carib Nation has put together a group of panelists who are very eminent, people who have studied the Caribbean and East Indians in the Caribbean. I have with me here today Dr. Mahain Gosain, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology from New York City. I also have here Dr. Danpal Narain, Professor on Education from New York City, and Mrs. Mala Rampatap, who is a businesswoman, broadcaster, and journalist. Dr. Gosain, can you give us an idea how East Indians really came to the Caribbean from India? In what year and under what conditions did they come?
East Indians in the Caribbean came during the indenture period. And the indenture period lasted for about 82 years. From about 1834, when the indenture system started, to Mauritius. Mauritius was the first country that...
Pause. So that the indenture period.
Yeah, maybe you should have explained some of the terms.
So I know the indenture period.
Post,
Yeah.
right. There was the slave period, and then
Yes.
there was indentured. So there was slavery, and then there was indentured servitude.
Yes. So indentured essentially was you were treated like a slave,
Paid,
but you were paid. You could
paid
work your
slave.
way out of a contract, but that contract would have been like
for a fixed term or
like 100 years unless you meet such and such quota.
It varied.
So yeah,
But-
it did. But essentially, that was the main difference between, and this is when like the Irish talk about slavery. A lot of the Irish days were indentured slaves, isn't it? Which is it is a different thing. Not saying that it was good or the conditions were good, but there is a significant difference between having a contract to do something and just being someone's property. But
Indeed.
not taking away from the Irish, you went through your shit as well, and obviously the Indians. But that always comes up when I speak to Irish people about slavery, and they're like, "Yeah, but we were slaves too," and I was like, "Yeah, but you indentured slaves is different. It's a different." So, yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
That receive indentured Indians, and the system was ended in 1917.
Yeah, but who brought them from the Caribbean? I mean, was it the British who were ruling India that brought them to the
Right.
Caribbean?
It was the British, it was the French, and it was the Dutch. In the Caribbean, there are a few countries with significant numbers of Indians. For example, in Guyana. Guyana has nearly 55% of Indians. Trinidad, about 45% of Indians. Suriname also has significant numbers of Indians. Smaller numbers of Indians were brought to Jamaica. Jamaica received about 37,000.
No, what we were doing was servitude was the name for the arrangement. Indentured was the contract. Chattel was the abduction.
Right.
Right. So chattel slavery was, kidnapped, banged on your head, shipped millions of miles, cut off from everything you ever known. And indentured was you actually walked down to the docks and voluntarily walked on the boat.
Yeah.
That's all.
If you want to pause it, you got a remote there, and you can.
Yo,
you can
press for Naji on the thing. Which one?
just press play.
Trinidad received 144,000. Guyana received 238,000. And much smaller numbers were brought to Grenada. They were brought to St. Vincent. They were brought to St. Lucia. They were brought to Martinique. They were brought to Guadeloupe. As far as getting to the Caribbean, they came under the indenture system, and the indenture system was one in which they were contracted for a period of 5 years.
But did they
after
come on their own
Wembley
free
Stadium
will, or were
twice,
they
isn't it?
taken there by force, like Africans were, for example, from Africa?
They were not
Few
necessarily taken by force. There was a recruiting system that helped the Britishers and the French and the Dutch to bring East Indians. Most of them were recruited. However, there was a tremendous amount of devious tactics that many of the colonial powers used to bring them to the Caribbean. Now, in terms of what you asked about the second part of your question, being brought to the Caribbean on the ships they were brought, there were a tremendous number of problems on the ships. For example, there was the outbreak of malaria, cholera, dysentery. In one instance, I read where something like 17% of those who were brought on the Ulysses died on the voyage to the New World. And it is argued that something like a total of 12% of the indentured immigrants who were brought during the indenture period, especially to the Caribbean, about 12%, died on the way over.
Dan Paul, give us an idea about when the East Indians came to the Caribbean, like Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so forth. They went into the sugar plantations, and they went to occupy the places of ex-slaves, because
Jumped
slavery was
from
abolished of
the
African
death
people.
toll to the
What were the
plantation.
conditions like in indentureship? What were the plantations like? Was it exactly like slavery? Was it similar to slavery? Give us an idea what it was like.
What was slavery
Well, thank
like?
you. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be in a Caribbean nation. Now, to answer your question, East Indians were replacing the ex-slaves after emancipation in 1838 on the plantations. The conditions were somewhat similar. In fact, Adamson has written a very good book called Sugar Without Slaves in 1972. And what he was saying is that East Indian indentureship was a new form of slavery, in that the laws were the same. You cannot leave the plantations without a pass. Some of the brutalities were the same.
For example, I have read that there have been examples where workers who disobeyed were being whipped on their back,
Yes.
and they put salt and pepper
Yes,
on their backs.
yes, as they did to the slaves on the plantations. And the whole idea under the plantation system after emancipation was to divide and rule the East Indians and the Negroes at that time. So that the system, again, to answer your question, was a new form of slavery. And East Indians on the plantations will tell you that, and scholars will tell you who have done the research, that conditions were very much similar.
Mohan, you want to say something?
I just wanted to add that it was basically, according to Krishna Bahadur Singh, he said it was a modified version of slavery. That's essentially what it was. Though I must say that towards the end of the indenture period in particular, the system began to become somewhat relaxed. For example, there are instances, at least in the Trinidad indenture system, I don't know what happened in Guyana in that respect, but as far as Trinidad is concerned, you could have still worked on the plantations. You could continue to work on the plantations as an indentured worker. But if you got married, for example, take for example my grandfather, when he got married, he was able to move out of the barracks and live with his wife close to the plantations, though he was still under contract.
Mala, there is a view, for example, in Guyana.
Thanks for that. It's like, yeah, I'm getting married. I'm going to do like marriages. I'm getting married so I can move out. Yes.
Well, that was a relaxation.
I know. But you can tell that guy was like really British though. The one here on the left is he definitely went to Oxford or somewhere like that.
Maybe not. Trinidad, innit? Very educated people.
For example, in Guyana, that the family system of the Indian people, the difference with slavery was that they were able to keep their religion and they were able to keep their family unit. How much truth is there to that within the indentureship system?
Well, I think there's a lot of validity to that statement. In fact, I would say that women were really, in the beginning of the indentureship period, were the main channel in which Indian domestic culture was maintained and retained. And let me just go back a little in terms of the journey of Indian women from India. On the first ship that sailed from Calcutta into Guyana was a ship called the Whitby. And not very many women came in those days. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the planters, the British back then, did not find the importation of women economically profitable on the plantation. So not many women came in the beginning. The second reason is that the Indian men that came on those ships, though they were married, intended to return back to India. As Dr. Gosain mentioned, they were here on a 5-year indentureship period. So they had intended to return to India, and thus they left their wives behind. So that was the second reason not many women came in the beginning. The third reason is, if we look at the quote-unquote, the status or the kinds of women that came, and perhaps this is where we have a bit of a dark history, because the women that came in the beginning were of a certain background. Most of them were single. A lot of them were widowed and therefore not allowed to be remarried. And a lot of them were separated from their husbands. So in the beginning, these were the backgrounds of the women that came.
So it wasn't so simple as saying that you had a consolidated family system. There were difficulties, there were problems.
Oh yes. And I remember stories that my grandmother would tell us. I mean, she came and you asked earlier, what were the Indians told in India in terms of the journey across the Kalapani, as we refer to it. And a lot of them were misled. My grandmother told stories where they were locked up for 2-3 days in like a station, and they were told that they were going to other parts of India. Many were told that they were going to the land of opportunities, and they were going to become more affluent. So
yeah, because I also read that there were cases of workers who thought they were not far away from India,
exactly.
And they were actually, in trying to escape, they were trying to swim over the river. Mohin, I wanted to ask you about this.
I just wanted to follow up
go
on what Mala had to say, and she's quite right on this, on that score. They used a lot of devious practices to recruit the Indians. And this went on in Chota Nagpur.
Who did it? Indians did it or the British did it?
Some of the Indian agents did
Indian
it.
agents.
As well as the colonialists, they did it too. And this happened around Calcutta, where the first set started to come from, the Chota Nagpur area, and then it moved northward to the Bihar area and the Uttar Pradesh districts. But in terms of what Mala was saying, that initially I was looking at Moses Sinarine's work, who just finished his PhD, his doctoral dissertation at Columbia. And Moses argued that at first, when the indenture system had gotten started, by the 1840s and 1850s, 35% of those who came were women. Then by the 1880s and 1890s, that figure had jumped to 50%. And then by 1914, 3 years before the end of the indenture system, it had fallen to 40%. Moses also argues that a lot of the women who came were Dalits. And Mala is quite right on that score. They were Dalits, they were lower caste women. And they were basically regarded as people who didn't have any kind of lucrative future in India. And Moses also has some numbers. He says that of all the Indians who came, which was more than 500,000 to the Caribbean, about 66,000 repatriated.
That's very interesting.
If I may just
Yes,
try to combine the two strands briefly. Yes, in Guyana, at the end, towards the end of the indentureship period, there was some modification of the rules in that mixing was allowed, people could leave the plantations freely, and things like that. The second question is, to what extent did the plantocracy allow East Indians to keep their culture intact? And it was more or less at the behest of the plantocracy that East Indians kept their marriage systems, their Ramayana, their Quran, and so on, because they didn't want too much mixing between ex-slaves.
Because of solidarity,
Exactly,
they would have class
exactly. They
solidarity.
didn't want too much mixing. And if you look at the system of settlement in places like Trinidad and British Guyana, you will find that there were separate villages that were created for East Indians and blacks to prevent this kind of intermixing, and hence solidarity.
In any form of oppression, whether it was slavery or semi-slavery, neo-slavery, as a historian, what we do, we look at things like, we say that people either adapt, they either commit suicide, they either escape, or they either rebel, or they either, resist. What was the situation with indentureship? Was there a history of resistance, a history of adaptation? Was it all four, all five?
Actually,
how did it evolve?
It was a combination of all of the things you mentioned. Some committed suicide.
Yeah.
Another tactic they used was to fake illness. Another tactic they used was to speak out against their overseers. Many also decided that they were going to run away. So there were a combination of tactics that they used. In terms of armed resistance...
Not armed, I mean strikes and so forth.
Armed resistance to the point where it happened in this country, for example, in the system of slavery. No. There were strikes. There were strikes in the 1880s, for example. I think Basdev Mangru has some work on this, and Basdev talks about the fact that in the 1880s, late 1880s, and until 1892, there were a number of strikes that they did engage in.
And when did indentureship end, Dan Paul?
Well, in 1917 in Guyana, British Guyana.
April 15, 1917. And in Trinidad?
The same year. The entire indenture system came to an end
across
in
the board.
1917. That is correct.
So April 15th would be the date across the board too?
Right. That came
That's
about.
very interesting.
Yeah, that came about because of what was happening with the Indian National Congress at the time. Pandit Madan Mohan Malavia, people like Balwant Singh, Motilal Nehru, who was all spearing this Gandhi.
Well, I was told that when Gandhi, after Gandhi confronted apartheid in South Africa and he became radicalized, he went back to India, and one of the things he did in the Congress Party was to lobby that no more should Indians be sent overseas because they were being exploited and their human rights were being violated.
Precisely.
Is that a fact?
But that is a fact.
Oh,
so Gandhi played an important role in the end of
Gandhi played an important role, but Gandhi came later. It was really Madan Mohan Malavia was the one who took up the whole issue and argued the case in the Indian Congress.
Mala, you made a reference about your grandparents and about some wanting to stay, some going back. Why after the indentureship had a contract and it had an expiration date, why after the dates expired for indentureship, why did the Indians did not go back to India? What made them stay on in Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica and all these other islands?
Well, very simply because also they were starting to have their roots settled in Guyana and in other countries in the Caribbean.
Is it not true that I was told that and I have read that the plantation owners, in order, after the end of indentureship, they had learned what had happened after slavery, that the Africans decided that they're going to leave the plantations and go on. And so they didn't want the migration of labor again to move away from plantation, that they give them plots of land to cancel their tickets.
Yeah, but
Can
then
you
see,
develop
Paul,
that a bit more?
In the process of the indentureship, things began to change for better. And as Indians, as the farmers, in the beginning, they started to lease the land towards the end of indentureship. And I think what they were finding is that, coming back to the fact of wanting to settle down there in Guyana and to start their roots, it was to some extent a lucrative situation.
Dan Paul, you want to say something?
Okay, there are two quick things we need to connect here. And the first is East Indian values, customs, tradition, culture. Slavery, if you compare and contrast indentureship to slavery, the whole design of slavery was meant to break up the family. In other words, mothers should be separate.
Now, the going back, so you've taken the lowest class of people in a society and put them away for 50 years. 5 years.
Well, yeah.
And in this system, they're still lower, but they're not the lowest, because obviously the blacks are the lowest. They're above the blacks, innit? Why would they want to go back to being the lowest? Because they're still Dalits when they go back, innit?
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't see the incentive for going back to
Hold on, pop the back.
empty.
I'm gonna have to,
You get me?
I can see it flashing.
So getting land, giving position, responsibility, and perceived step up in social class. It's got to be an attractive prospect. Plus, the weather's good. You've been there 5 years.
Well, you got something on it as well, didn't you? Like they said, they were just given land, so why would
I
they be
guess
going
for the
back?
ones who were married, they had to go back. Because some of them just went, thought they was close to India 5 years, and they'll be back home.
The whole design of
He was
slavery
just
was
getting
meant to break up the family.
saying, yeah.
In other words, mothers should be separated from fathers, brothers, and sisters, and American experience is a good testimony to that. Whereas indentureship, they didn't mind parents being together with their children, brothers and sisters being together. They didn't mind people having their priests with them, their holy texts with them, their marriage institution, and their
That was
religious
tolerated.
That was
Yeah,
tolerated.
there wasn't a breakup within the family. Not at all.
because if you separate, you can rule.
But what
Now,
about the issue of land?
Okay, the second point about land. The question you asked is why is it that they prefer to stay rather than return? And there are two reasons why. One is land, and second is kinship. Land and kinship. The history of East Indians, the world over, especially those who have left India, has been an affinity between them and the land. The soul of East Indians is connected to the land.
We're going to take a break now, and we are going to come back and continue to look at some of these issues on East Indians in the Caribbean. Don't switch your TV off. Do come back.
The Dalits have land.
Well, in India, in the Caribbean, well, they didn't have it
They
in
were
India, but they
Dalits
had
in
it
the
in the
Caribbean,
Caribbean.
weren't they? So when they were in India, did they have land? We'll check that out.
If we're gonna talk
think
the
so.
talk, if we're gonna talk the talk, we better walk the walk until our work is done. Yeah, there's a better world that we can build if we all just take the time to leave no child behind.
That's a Caribbean thing. I was wondering, that's different.
Welcome back to Carib Nation. We are discussing East Indians in the Caribbean. Gosain, I would like us now to discuss a bit, and Dan Paul and Mala, I would like to discuss a bit now a very important issue. East Indians came with the identity that they were East Indians from India to the Caribbean. They've lived through that whole period from over nearly 160 years, independence and all that. What did they consider, how do they consider themselves now? As Caribbean people, as Indo-Caribbean people, as West Indians? How do they define their identity now? And what explain, or how do you explain the changes that have occurred in their lives and their culture and their identity over the years on these new land spaces?
I think that when you look at trying to forge a Caribbean East Indian identity, you have to look at that identity, or forging that identity over a period of time. Meaning simply that by the turn of the 20th century, Indians would have regarded themselves as a part of the Caribbean, but the African segment of the population, chances are, were not willing to accept that. As time went on, and as Indians began to get into the educational arena, as they began to get into the political arena, as they began to emerge as the petty bourgeois of the country and so on, we began to see them carving out an identity more and more for themselves. To this day, there is still some argument as to whether or not East Indians...
Right. Slaves are brought, do their 400 years, set free, not given land, not given anything, but you can stay here as long as you're doing something. Right. Indians are recruited, go through a process with the end date. Given land. Which gives you position and property. And then they said, as they began to, as soon as you got the land, you were part of the next class, innit? A landowner. So
I guess you're part of the next class, but it doesn't mean that you're accepted by the next class.
But how would you be accepted by people who haven't been given anything after 400 years and you did 5 years and got land?
No, this is what I'm saying, but I'm not talking about them. I'm saying for the Indians, they're not thinking about that, are they? They're just thinking like, we've been given land. Why are they thinking about? You have to think about it as well. Remember, their cultures and everything have been kept separate throughout this whole period, so they didn't even mix or talk. So it weren't like a thing where, they didn't. But this is what they're saying.
There was an effort not to do it, but we live in mixed communities now, and there are different communities. They do.
Now they do.
They do talk.
Now, but at the time, you say that anyway. But I know Chinese people don't speak to no one.
Right.
But Chinese people. So what I'm saying is, there was an effort from the overseers or the ruling or the colonials
divide and rule.
To divide and rule.
That still exists today.
So
that's
like,
class and stratification generally. So it
for
exists
the Indians,
Britain's child, that is.
Exactly. So for the Indians, they're just doing what they're doing, innit? They're just like, well, basically, we're just looking after us and we're doing what we're doing. Yeah, so I can understand from the Africans, of course there's going to be resentment. It's going to be like, you're giving them land, like we've been here 400 years, and now they've just like jumped ahead of us. However, what I would say is, for the Africans, the affinity with the Caribbean must have been different anyway. Because you were slaves, fully you were brought there. So the Indians most of them had a choice to go there. Whereas as Africans, you were just like you said, chatteled there. It's generations slavery. So the feeling of the Caribbean should have been different anyway.
I think, right.
We're going to have to take a break.
Battery again.
Battery, dude. We're going to have to take
That'll be the end of that subject then.
10 minutes. No, we'll come back. I'll rewind it.
Yeah, but I remember what we were saying then. Jumping in the middle of some other conversation.
Go on then. Get your point off. Is that on there?
Well, the black people, I don't believe had feelings about anything because they had no ownership, no power. They were chattel. The
Yes.
Asian people had power, so they had a perception of feeling and where they wanted to be perceived. So they're talking about their perception of being accepted, but the people who have no power, you don't know your mama, your sister, or your thing.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
have
yeah,
no
yeah.
concept of who's in power and who's not in power. They're trying to live day to day. So his premise that a resentment by the black people made saying like there was structured black communities and they had feelings and there was community sentiment. It was some cows, effectively. That's how they were treated. No education, no reading, no anything. You know, bred with your parents. A completely different lifestyle to come in with your wife and your people and your family and getting piece
And
of
the
land.
culture. And,
But
yeah,
then you who
definitely.
have your descent, oh, well, there was a perception or a resentment by it. No, those people were busy trying to stay alive. They weren't concerned what you had or didn't have.
I don't know, man. Like, I don't know, because I could see there would be a resentment. I could see why there would be a resentment as
But
well.
that resentment comes with, like I said, all right, let's imagine you're
I'm
in
saying
prison.
it's not just.
You're in
it's
prison.
just-
You're in prison.
Yeah.
They have the upper system for the prisoner who turns kind of supervisor, and
Yeah. Oh,
the
yeah.
prisoners don't like them.
The Uncle Tom.
It exists. You understand? So they become overseers in the same system, even though they're a prisoner. They're given privileges because they come from among the prisoners. Then there's resentment. But for the employed guards who had
You don't
paid
have to say
cheap,
prisoners. That
and
just happens at work.
well, they're getting privileges because of what they do.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you
yeah.
get privileged by breaking rank with the mass,
Yes.
and you become an overseer within that system. And that's the same. The prisoners resent them because they're from among them, but they don't
But they're
resent the
not
prison
from
guards.
among them, though.
Who's
This
the prisoners?
This is the misconception. Like, Africans and Indians don't come from the same place.
Yeah. This is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So,
they're
but
not the
that's
same.
why there was no connect. What an Indian is saying, we were resented, and I'm arguing that why would someone who doesn't even know what they is resenting you for anything? Your resentment comes with ownership, ego, and I've got something. It doesn't come with down and out. It comes the opposite way around. Well, yeah, you resent me because I got new shoes every day or new socks. You never hear the person saying, unless they're gonna steal it off you or something. But
No, I think resentment goes both ways. I know people who resent people because they
It's
see them and they're happy.
a
I know
position of
I know
privilege,
people
man.
who
They
are.
resent people that they know. So you resent people from among your group. You don't resent the other people.
No, that's not true. You can have resentment. Listen, you can have resentment for someone just because they're doing well. It's that
Why would you
simple.
resent them?
Because that's how people's mindsets work.
Right, but how do you have resentment with someone that outside your group? This
What
is
do you
what
mean?
I'm saying. You don't resent Elon Musk because he's doing well, because he's not from within your group. You resent people that you know, innit? And what I'm saying is the
Yeah,
communities
okay,
were different.
I guess I hear what
So
you're
the
saying.
blacks would resent blacks who achieved. They wouldn't resent Indians or
Indians.
anything because they were different anyway, different groups. They came in under different circumstances. They were like middle managers employed,
Yes.
and the blacks weren't anything. They were just laborers, effectively.
Yeah.
And as I said, the Indians who came were effectively the laborers in India. When they came and got land,
That elevated them.
that elevated them as a whole. So their view from that elevated position backwards is that they were resented. But why would someone resent you if you had nothing and we didn't talk to you anyway? Why would we even think about it? How would we know you got something? You know, you was there anyway. You've been there for the last 160 years.
The Indians you meet, they will tell you definitely, yes, we are. But at the same time, they don't see themselves as just people who live in a society where we can talk about nationhood. We can talk about nationhood, but we have to understand that within these nations, there are a medley of ethnic groups, each one wanting to have its own identity. So there's a kind of cultural pluralism, and the debate rages on. Now, Sam Selvin, who passed away
So
a
what
few
you're
years
really
ago,
saying is that the racial identity is paramount to the national identity?
precisely.
So, but what I'm saying is that when they were in India, they were called East Indians.
Correct.
Now they're in the Caribbean. What do they call themselves? Are they, Dan Paul, are they Indo-Caribbeans? Are they Indo-Guyanese? Are they Indo-Trinidadians?
Well,
are they East Indian Trinidadians? What label is used?
It comes back to the point one had made earlier, and that deals with nationalism. See, nationalism requires two things. One, a sense of ideology, and two, the wherewithal to implement this ideology. Remember, as early as a generation ago, East Indians were not quite sure whether they were East Indians or whether they were British subjects or Guyanese. In fact, Mr. J.D. Tyson, the East Indian Immigration Agent General, was sent by the government of India in 1940, as recent as 1940, to agitate for East Indian rights in British Guyana and plantations. This was a man from India who went to British Guyana, the sugar estates, to campaign for East Indian rights.
But we are talking about now.
But now, what happened? What happened now?
About now, yeah.
But I think up until now, actually, if Indians in the Caribbean do not consider and are not accepted as West Indians, the only time we're really accepted as West Indians is when we come out to play the sport of cricket. Then we're all together and we're all one. We're seen as West Indians, the black community and the Indian community, and perhaps in Trinidad more so now with the with Carnival. But if you think of the Caribbean from a more worldly perspective, what comes to mind first is the black community. You do not think of.
So you're saying that the Caribbean has a stamp of the African rather than the stamp of the East Indian.
Absolutely.
There's an absence of the stamp.
Now,
But
but
this brings me to a question I'd like you to focus on. Give me an idea about some instances or good examples of how the culture of Indians have either been retained or modified being in Trinidad and Guyana and the Caribbean. Because I think because I know that you have the religion,
right,
you have the Indian movies and so forth, but there also been acculturation occurring and transacculturation. Let Mohamed, for example, the Afro-Trinidadians identify with Calypso, and all Caribbean people do, but they know it's African format. They contributed to it. But I know in Trinidad they also have been able, the Indians, to parallel that with the chutney. Can you tell us more about this kind of acculturation and transacculturation?
In any society where you have a medley of ethnic groups, any multi-ethnic society, there would be a certain amount of mixing. And that mixing would take place at a cultural level, and it would also take place at a structural level, assimilation both culturally and structurally. Chutney, if you listen to Chutney carefully, it has a lot of Indian lyrics in it. But Chutney also has a lot of English lyrics, and it has lyrics pertaining to the local dialects. But yet Chutney also has very much of a calypso beat. Now, calypso, of course, as we well know, was started in the hills of Laventille by the African segment of the population. And part of the whole emergence of calypso had to do with a kind of reaction, you know, black folk singing these songs against the colonial masters, and it created a sense of unity and group solidarity and so on. So the Indians have taken that. Now in Trinidad today, for example, Marla and myself were talking about this before the show. We were talking about the extent to which Indians are participating in Carnival. In the old days, you wouldn't find a lot of Indians participating in Carnival. Now, some of the best bands in Trinidad are very much played in by Indians. Indians also some of the best panmen in Trinidad, where traditionally most of the panmen were of the African segment of the population.
But there's something that I've always thought about and wondered whether it doesn't have to do with this problem of identifying with the nation states. When the Africans were freed from slavery, they celebrate the day that they had emancipation. I find that East Indians celebrate what they call Arrival Day, which was the very first day that they entered indentureship, the very first day they entered semi-slavery. Why is it East Indians do not celebrate the end of indentureship rather than the beginning of indentureship? And what connection does that have to do with their whole ideology and their whole consciousness in terms of nationalism with regard to these countries?
It has to do with reactionary politics.
Okay.
And this is something I have thought about. When you look at the celebration of Arrival Day, which is in May, late May, But Indian Arrival Day and its celebration did not come about until Emancipation Day, which is in August. Emancipation Day for the black community came about long before Indian Arrival Day. So once again we see the Indians' reaction. The Indians felt that the African segment of the population now had a day whereby
So
which
why
they
did
can
they react to the day of liberation
to the day of
rather
liberation.
than the day
because,
of entrance into...
because in a sense there was no liberation.
Oh, there was no liberation.
1917 marked the end of indenture. But I think one also has to understand it was a kind of transition.
It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a
you see,
rupture.
That's right.
As slavery was.
Absolutely.
As the end of slavery
Precisely.
It was a
And what happened
celebration.
was the end of slavery in this country, for example, 1834, you know, with Wilberforce, and then in the British Isles by 1838, what we began to see, this was a kind of worldwide movement.
Well, Dr. Gosen, that's a very good note for us to end this program. And I would like to thank you for having come on the program, Carib Nation. Dr. Dan Paul, I'd like to thank you. And Mala, I'd like to thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the second series that we will do on East Indians in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
East Indians in the Caribbean is a very fascinating experience. As you have heard, very poor people, some of them single parents, some of them coming from the outcasts of India, went all the way to the Caribbean and made tremendous contributions creating new nation states. They have been able to have over 160 years very stable inter-ethnic, interracial relations in the Caribbean. This is Carib Nation once more saying thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next series.
Yeah. Now we're watching the credits, Will. Gotta remember that big boss.
Whoa! So what did you think to the round view, Dad?
Interesting. I love that shit. Caribbean. Like I said, Caribbean was a big prison and a lot of people went in. Some became institutionalized, like in any system. And I think that's for all communities. Whichever way you got in, you loved it, you hated it, it worked for you, it didn't work for you. Some people were free to leave. Some people are still free to leave. Which means that some people were never free to leave. There was obviously, a chance to travel abroad at a point for masses. I think the whole community has been migrant labor around the Caribbean and the South Americas anyway. Panama and all them things. So all the Caribbean islands have moved around doing farming and stuff, generally amongst themselves. The distinction between communities is the fact that after, what my man says, 160 years, there is still an Indian community. Now, is that because there's new people coming in from India, or is that because they've maintained that limited gene pool amongst themselves for 160 years? Knowing black people, they like to blend regardless of... so I would imagine that would be Indian people have retained their identity as a whole, but having started with a backdrop to do that, Caribbean people didn't have a backdrop, just oppression.
Yeah.
So they were willing to engage with anybody who they perceived. I think deep thinkers weren't the end of slavery people. It was just people who wanted to fit in and blend and be treated like a human being effectively. So they would have been more willing to still, blend in with other communities for partnerships and relationships. They didn't have structure or organize because they hadn't had it for 400 years.
Yeah.
So they knew of the desire for it, but being free to do it without the worry of that any day a man can come in and say, boy, your sons have just sold them down the road or to another island. you know, that in itself is oppressive. Not even being able to grow your kids or knowing if you're going to see them when you get home or if you're going to get home.
Well, listen, the whole from start to finish slavery is oppressive, but that's the point, isn't it? You're not a human
Whereas
being. There's
the other
indentured.
community was free to not have
But
those thoughts.
I think them three done exactly. So I think them three did well to represent that, because I think a lot of people try and lose that, and they try and make out like indentured slavery was the same. You may have had at the start it was thing, but essentially it's not the same. Like you wasn't owned. Indentured slavery.
Servitude, not slavery.
Well, people call it indentured slavery, isn't it? When you learn about it, it's
No, they want to call
slavery.
it indentured slavery.
Yes, but this is what I'm saying.
Slavery and indentured servitude.
Okay, so the two, this is what I'm saying. So the two are very distinctly different, but people try and muddy the lines and say that they're very,
depends
very
which
similar.
part of the ladder you're on. As I said, if I was, you know, let's go to the Jamaican situation. Complexion. Complexion is a big thing in Jamaica.
Yeah.
You know, they don't talk about it openly. Complexion's a big thing in India and everywhere else. But if we just based on our own inner problems, like I said, in the society our parents come from, it's centered around the higher the complexion, the higher the quality of the person. That is the basic thinking. It's only recent history where people are pushing that aside, but then there are universities and actual education systems there now, not someone responding to the dictate from a master or an employer. You know, so the conditions of slavery may have ended, but the conditions were still there. The
Yes, this is what I
mentality and
mean.
everything was there. People were able to get away from the island and learn a lot more, but when they came back, where was the medium for sharing that? Were there local newspapers and
The resources, the
you
infrastructure.
know, it was local information. If you knew someone who did it, you knew, and you heard about someone. But
Yeah, I thought that was a good video. Anyway, like, we'll have to dig into that a bit more. I think definitely enjoyed watching that. We out.
peace.
Peace.